Dr. Gates is a familiar and welcome face at the National Constitution Center. In 2011, the Constitution Center honored Dr. Gates with the prestigious Liberty Medal Award for his distinguished career promoting effective diplomacy and supporting American troops around the world, and it's great to have him back tonight. Prior to serving as the 22nd Secretary of Defense, Dr. Gates was the president of Texas A&M University. He joined the Central Intelligence Agency in 1966 and spent nearly 27 years as an intelligence professional. Dr. Gates served as director of the CIA from 1991 to 1993. He is the only career officer in the CIA's history to rise from entry-level employee to director. Among his many awards and accolades, he is the recipient of the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the country's highest civilian honor. He also received the National Security Medal and the Presidential Citizens Medal. And as a testament to his resilience and strength, he is with us this evening for the very first stop in his book tour, despite an unfortunate injury in the early new year, and for that we are very grateful. Tonight he takes us inside his just-released new book, Duty, Memoirs of a Secretary at War, his first book since stepping down in 2011 as U.S. Defense Chief. Duty is an account of Dr. Gates' 4.5 years serving as Secretary of Defense under both President George W. Bush and Barack Obama. It has been called forthright and impassioned and highly revealing by the New York Times, and an ultimately unsparing examination of the modern ways of making politics, policy, and war by the Boston Globe. Tonight's moderator is Chris Mondix, who covers legal affairs for the Philadelphia Inquirer as a member of the business news staff. Before joining the business department, he was a Washington correspondent for the Inquirer, covering, among other topics, the impeachment of President Clinton, the collapse of Enron and Arthur Anderson, the 9/11 attacks, and the 9/11 Commission investigation. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming our esteemed guests for this evening, Dr. Robert M. Gates and Chris Mondix.
Thank you. Thank you. Secretary Gates, I also want to thank you for being here, especially in light of the fact that you've recently had an injury. I know you're making a robust recovery, but having to wear a neck brace has surely complicated your being here and getting here, and we thank you for making that effort.
When until I became Secretary of Defense, I had never broken a bone or had a surgery. In February of 2008, I fell on the ice and broke this shoulder in 3 places. And 10 months later, putting a snowplow blade on a tractor, I pulled the bicep tendon off this arm. My security guards quickly came to the conclusion that Al-Qaeda was no risk to me at all compared to myself. And before we start, I'd like to say it is good to be back here at the center and to apologize to the audience on my right for not turning in your direction, but the result of a broken neck is somewhat limited mobility of my head.
Well, that being said, let's get to your book, Duty, Memoirs of the Secretary at War. I found it a most striking account of your time under both President Bush and President Obama, not the least because it gave what I would call an almost real-time account of your interchanges with President Obama and the former Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, as you and other very top members of the nation's security establishment, as you wrestled with the difficulties on the ground in Afghanistan. And I'd like to talk to you at some length about your impressions of President Obama. But before we get into that, I wanted to focus on a part of the book that hasn't gotten that much attention, but which I think is equally important. And that's your description of the situation in the government, in the White House, when you took over as Secretary of Defense in December of 2006. You describe a dire situation in Iraq. American troops are dying at increasing rates. The insurgents are gathering force. There's extreme explosive sectarian violence, and no apparent plan on the part of the United States government for coping with that. The takeaway from that part of the book is that we hadn't planned properly for the occupation, and that that indeed it never occurred to military planners that we might be there as long as we had. Why were we so mistaken on that point? Why did we miss that?
One of the concluding sections of the book is, in effect, on lessons learned about war. And one of the things that you'd think people would understand would be how frequently people who advocate going to war and people who make decisions to go to war almost always are convinced the war will be short. This year we'll celebrate the centenary of World War I, which is a classic example of where everybody thought the war would be over by October or November 1914. The problem in Iraq in particular, and it really is true of both Iraq and Afghanistan, that what began as swift military victories quickly degenerated into long and grinding wars. In the case of Iraq, it was always believed that it would be a short-term commitment. I think it would be interesting to ask those who were participants in the decision-making, had they known in March 2003 that the country would be at war in Iraq for 6 or 7 more years, whether they would have made the decision they did. But this assumption that the war would be short or that its end was right around the corner afflicted the Department of Defense as badly as it did the decision makers themselves. And because everyone assumed that the war would be over quickly, there was a great reluctance inside defense to spend significant sums of money on equipment that might be needed to protect the troops, but that might be useful only in Iraq or Afghanistan. As I describe it in the book, the Department of Defense is organized to plan for war, not to wage war. And so the services dedicate all of their efforts, pretty much all of their efforts, to developing their long-range procurement plans and then defending those plans in the budget process regardless of what comes along. And so people were reluctant to, for example, develop and fund the mine-resistant ambush-protected vehicles that save so many lives and limbs, because that particular kind of vehicle was not in any plan for the Army or the Marine Corps for the long term.
I'd like to ask you about that in just a moment. One of the key themes in that portion of the book, it seems to me, is that the military planners inside the Beltway, civilian leaders inside the Beltway, simply didn't adjust or respond to, and in fact, you do right, they did not adjust to changing situations on the ground in Iraq.
The fact that I also write that after the initial invasion, there was just a series of stunningly bad decisions and mistakes.
Well, I'd like to read a portion of the book, a situation that came across to me as scandalous. And I say this also because you heap quite a bit of praise on President Bush in this. And I think your critique of the president and the much reported critiques of President Obama have missed the point in that they're part of a larger fabric and evaluation of both of these men, which is much more nuanced than we've gotten so far. But let me read this one portion which describes what I think is a scandalous situation. Our fundamentally flawed and persistent assumption from the outset that the Iraq War would be a short one caused many problems on the ground and for the troops. As the months stretched into years, those at senior levels nevertheless clung to their original assumption and seemed unwilling to invest substantial dollars to provide the troops everything they needed for protection and for success in their mission, and to bring them home safely, and if wounded, to provide them with the very best care. Who wanted to spend precious dollars on equipment for today's troops that after Iraq would just be surplus? So for years in Iraq, our troops traveled in light vehicles like Humvees, the modern equivalent of a Jeep, that even with armoring were vulnerable to weapons such as improvised explosive devices, rocket-propelled grenades, and explosively formed projectiles. Were people asleep at the switch why did they not respond to casualties were increasing? What we were doing in Iraq was not working. Were they not visiting the country enough? Were they getting bad information? Why was there such bureaucratic resistance to making change?
Well, I think, as I indicated earlier, I think they kept thinking that the end of the war was right around the corner. Throughout 2006, the commander in the field until the fall of 2006, our commander in Baghdad was still planning to draw down from 15 to 10 brigades by the end of 2006, and only realized toward the end of 2006 that wouldn't be possible. Actually, the first person, I think, seriously to conclude that the strategy wasn't working was President Bush. And I think that happened probably in the late spring or summer of 2006. There were several different reviews launched of our strategy, including the most important one was probably led by the National Security Council staff, which then led to the president's decision to surge troops to get control of the security situation, particularly in Baghdad. This is a case, and I pointed out, it's been presented mostly in a negative light, but I don't think it's a negative consideration, that both Bush and Obama pushed back against the generals. In the case of Iraq in 2006, it was the civilian leadership that decided the strategy wasn't working, not the military. And when Bush decided to support the Iraq surge, he was opposed by the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, the theater commander, the commander in Baghdad, and the commander of Central Command in Florida.
But I must ask you, though, you can hardly characterize that as a brilliant insight. The entire country seemingly had turned against the war because we were not doing well there. Why did the generals come? Why were they so late when everybody else had decided this was not going well?
I wish I had an explanation for that. I wasn't there. I think they had concluded that their view was that more troops would aggravate the situation rather than help it. It would let the Iraqis off the hook in terms of assuming responsibility for their own security, and that that the Iraqis were expecting to see a reducing U.S. presence, not an increasing one.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to ask you one other question on this subject. You write in the book that General Shinseki famously predicted at a congressional hearing that an occupation would require, this is before the invasion, I think in March of whenever it occurred, that an occupation would require hundreds of thousands of troops. Was he right? Would that have been a better approach?
Well, I think that the initial. This goes back to the mistakes that I think were made after the original invasion. Had the Iraqi army not been disbanded, which was one of those catastrophic mistakes in my view, turning 400,000 men who didn't know anything else except how to shoot into the civilian economy with no support for their families, was just a formula for disaster. If those troops, if we had done our best to keep the Iraqi army coherent, but with different leadership, then you probably would not have seen the looting that took place in Baghdad and elsewhere, and you might have had greater civil order that would have prevented the sectarian violence that became so bad by 2006. So the number of troops required after the invasion in part depended on making smart decisions about what we would do next in Iraq. I said in a speech in May of 2003, just 6 weeks after the invasion, that now that we had overthrown Saddam, it reminded me of the situation where the dog catches the car. Mm-hmm. Now what do you do with it? And I said at the time, if we have more than 100,000 troops in Iraq for more than a few months, we will be in serious trouble. And that I said I thought that the political part of this would be far more difficult than the original invasion. So I think if different decisions had been made in that period after the original invasion, then you might have had a different outcome. But we ended up with what we did, and people seemed unwilling to stick their neck out to say that was a really stupid decision, de-Baathification. I mean, I write in the book, it's like nobody ever read a book about the denazification. And the fact that you had to, if you ran the local power plant, you still had to be a member of the party. That didn't mean you were Himmler's best friend. The same thing in Iraq. You had to be a member of the Ba'ath Party if you were a school teacher. So just being oblivious to those kinds of things just led to some amazingly stupid decisions.
It wasn't just a matter of their military infrastructure being dissolved, but also the civilian bureaucracy as well, which I think just disappeared overnight and left you with absolutely nothing. I have to ask you that...
It goes in a way, and it goes to the equipment question you asked me. Secretary Rumsfeld famously said to a soldier, "You go to war with the army you have." And that's true. But what I add is, then you better make it into the army that you need as fast as you can. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think we did not do.
Yeah. I have to ask you this. You mentioned in the book, and I think I have this right, that your good friend, Brent Scowcroft, a very senior national security official in Bush 41, I think it was, the first Bush administration, opposed the invasion in Iraq. And I was wondering, do you never really address that issue as far as you are concerned in this book? Had you been asked, had you been part of the administration then, would you have supported the Iraq War?
Well, I say in the last chapter of sort of summing up and reflections that I don't know. It's hard for me to say what I would have advocated in 2003. I, like a lot of people in the Congress and most other countries in the world, initially all accepted the argument that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction. That's how UN Security Council Resolution 1441 got passed. The intelligence services of even Russia and China thought he had these weapons. And so in that speech that I referred to a few weeks after the invasion, I said that I had supported the original decision for that reason. But I say in the book toward the end that, I had argued strongly against going to Baghdad in 1991 in the first Gulf War. Because that would have meant to try and overthrow the regime, to get Saddam, would have meant occupying 2/3 of Iraq, and then it would be our problem. And so we were unanimous in the first Bush administration in opposing the idea of going to Baghdad, and we took a lot of grief for it, for not completing the job. We tended not to get that criticism after March 2003 anymore, but I argued maybe I would have made the same argument I did in 1991 about going to Baghdad. I also might have been far more skeptical because of my intelligence background. I might have been far more skeptical of the intelligence case that he had weapons of mass destruction than others were around the table, just because I have a pretty good view of both the strengths and the weaknesses of our intelligence capabilities. So I think it's, to be honest, I think it's hard for me to say what I would have advocated in 2003 with 10 years of hindsight.
Right. Could you talk a little bit about your effort to get these more hardened vehicles for the troops in Iraq? You were surprised to learn that there were these vehicles in development, these MRAPs, mine-resistant, ambush-protected vehicles that, as you say, went a long way toward reducing casualties. How did you get that done? And I noted, for example, that Senator Biden was a target of much of your criticism. The book helped you a lot in that regard.
Yeah, and I give him credit for it in the book. Actually, it's a lesson that I tried to hammer home to the senior civilian and military leaders in terms of paying attention when they read criticism in the newspapers, not to go into a defensive crouch, but to go find out whether the story is true or not. It was a newspaper series in the Washington Post that put me on to the problem with wounded warriors at Walter Reed that led me to fire the Secretary of the Army. It was a newspaper story where I first read about these MRAPs, these heavily armored vehicles, and I read in USA Today that the Marines had about 300 of these vehicles in Anbar province, and in over 1,000 attacks, not a single Marine had been killed who was riding in one of these vehicles. I got some briefings on it, and I wanted to buy these things in large numbers, and there was no one in the Department of Defense at a senior level, either civilian or in uniform, who supported that decision. And I basically said, well, we're going to do it. And this is one place, I'm very critical of the Congress in this book, but this is one place where the Congress did the right thing, and they did it in a timely way, and they gave me all the money I asked for, and we ended up buying 27,000 of these vehicles for Iraq and Afghanistan. And one of the measures that meant the most to me, there are lots of statistics out there in terms of lives saved and limbs that weren't lost, but when I first became secretary and visited the Army's burn unit at Brooke Army Hospital in San Antonio, it was absolutely full, because most of those young men had been in Humvees that had blown up and became funeral pyres for them. By the time I was within 6 months of leaving as secretary, that burn unit was nearly empty. And so, ultimately everybody came around to the fact this is a really good idea, let's get on with it, probably because I said so as Secretary of Defense. But there was a lot of opposition, and again, because these vehicles weren't in anybody's long-term procurement plan, and they were more worried about what they would do with them after the war than what good they might do in the war. My attitude is, particularly when you're dealing with the lives of young men and women, is when you're in a war, you're all in, and whatever it takes to protect them, whatever it takes to give them the tools to do the job and then come home safely, you make that investment. And if you got all this stuff surplus at the end of the war, so be it.
I found that book, part of the book, one of the most disturbing parts of the book, because here was a method that was available to the military to save lives, yet for narrow reasons of bureaucratic agendas, it wasn't implemented. How do you fix a problem like that going forward? It seems to me that's cultural, and the culture, no doubt, survived after you left.
Well, it's a leadership. It's a leadership issue. I'll give you another example that is even more shocking in my view. The medevac time, the time for medevac in Iraq was an hour, called the golden hour, that a helicopter could be dispatched, pick up a soldier who'd been wounded, and get him to a hospital within an hour. In Afghanistan, it was 2 hours. And I said, I think it should be an hour. Just like in Iraq. And both uniformed and civilian senior officials came to me and had all these statistics about how the death rates were comparable for medevac in Iraq and Afghanistan, despite the time difference and so on. And therefore, because it was statistically pretty much a wash, it wasn't worth the investment to put additional resources into it. My reaction was a pretty simple one. If I'm a soldier and I've been blown up, I want a helicopter there as quickly as possible. So I said, we're just going to do it. And so we sent more helicopters, several additional field hospitals. I made that decision in January of 2008 or 9, I can't remember which. And by July, something like 80% of our medical evacuations were taking place in less than 40 minutes. But it was, the problem in part, it seemed to me, was that the people who were in charge of these things, weren't looking at them from the soldier's standpoint. They were looking at it from sort of 30 or 40,000 feet. The other problem in the Pentagon that I talk about that relates to all of these issues is that there are so many different elements of the Department of Defense who have to be on board, who have to agree to move anything forward, that any one of those elements, whether it's the money people or the technology people or the budgeteers or whatever, can basically slow down or stop something from happening. Only the Secretary of Defense has the authority to override everybody in the building and say, we're just going to do it.
In other words, it requires a leader with a considerable willpower and commitment to getting this thing done. I wanted to ask you...
well, and there's nothing like getting the attention of the senior military and the Pentagon as a whole, like firing some people.
Which you did a lot of, I can tell from the book.
Yes. I held people accountable, right. And my attitude was, in the case of both Walter Reed and the nuclear issue, which is back in front of us, when I fired both the Chief of Staff and Secretary of the Air Force, I didn't fire them for not knowing about the problem in the first place. I fired them because once they knew about it, they didn't take it seriously enough. And that's the kind of accountability that I think needs to be exercised more frequently in Washington.
Since you brought up the issue of firing, how did you feel about losing Stanley McChrystal?
Well, at first, I felt he committed a terrible error, and I say so in the book, giving access to this reporter. And McChrystal is probably one of the most effective combat generals we've had since World War II. Both as commander in Afghanistan and as commander of the Joint Special Operations unit in Iraq and Afghanistan. He did a lot of damage to our enemies and people who were killing our troops. But the world of politics and the media was a new battle space for General McChrystal, and he was a brand new second lieutenant in that realm. And as effective as he was in the command position, he stepped out of line in some of his interviews. But I felt when the article came out about him with the quotes that seemed to disparage the vice president and the national security advisor and others, my worry was that if he was relieved, that we might lose the war in Afghanistan right then and there. We now had, by that time, we had the timeline the president had decided, which I supported, of being all our combat troops out by the end of 2014. And he got along well with Karzai. He knew the battle plan. He knew the brigade commanders. There was a familiarity there, and I worried that finding a replacement would take months to get confirmed and then more months to get acclimated and up to speed. And so I was deeply worried that relieving McChrystal would be a huge setback in the war. And then it was the president, in discussing whether to relieve McChrystal, who said, how about Dave Petraeus to take over? And immediately, and I give the president a lot of credit for the idea, because it hadn't even occurred to me, but that alleviated a lot of my concerns, because Petraeus knew the battle plan, knew the brigade commanders, knew Karzai, and had a good relationship with him, and so on. So I felt like we really wouldn't lose much time in the war if McChrystal were replaced by Petraeus. And I told, as I say in the book, I wish Stan had given me something to defend him with, that the story was wrong in some particulars. But as I write in the book, it was sort of like he was at West Point again and just saying, no excuse, sir. And so under those conditions, as I write in the book, I thought the president had no choice but to relieve him.
Yeah, I found that part a little bit puzzling, although there was a history, as you point out. For those in the audience who don't know, Stanley McChrystal was a special operations commander who had tremendous success in Iraq before going to Afghanistan, was a war hero, had caused taken out of the battle this very feared al-Qaeda commander, Zarqawi, I think it was, and was instrumental in capturing Saddam Hussein, a revered soldier whose staff in Afghanistan made some very unfortunate and candid remarks to a Rolling Stone reporter. When he was called out on the carpet, and this is after, I gather, he had made some other unfortunate remarks in London, not sensational, but rather off the reservation and not closely tracking with the president's preferred policy positions, making the president mad. He had already had a couple of strikes against him. When this came up, you said that General McChrystal didn't take any steps to defend himself, even though there was possibly an argument that he could have used. Why?
Well, I think, first of all, I think Stan was, I'm assuming some things here because I never really had a detailed conversation with Stan about why he didn't defend himself, only that he didn't. But I think that he knew he had made the decision to allow this non-traditional reporter to be a part of his entourage. I think he was stunned by the article, and he may not, an Army Inspector General report suggested he may not have known about a lot of the statements that were made by his staff to this reporter. And so I think he didn't quite know how to respond. He didn't want to throw his staff under the bus. And so I think he did what he saw as the ethical thing for a commander to do under the circumstances, which was to take the hit.
One portion of this book struck...
But let me just say,
go ahead.
just to build on one of your observations, I mean, there was a lot of ill will toward General McChrystal in the White House because during the fall of 2009, when we were debating options for Afghanistan, including whether to go with what he had recommended as 40,000 additional troops or other options with smaller numbers that had been advocated by the Vice President and others, there were a number of leaks and public statements by the military, including by General McChrystal, that made it appear to the White House and to the President that the military was trying to box him in and force his hand to adopt their option in terms of the 40,000 troops. I tried to convince the President that I could see where this suspicion came from because of these leaks and public statements. The President saw it, and others around him, Vice President Biden and others, saw it as an orchestrated campaign by the military leadership. I tried to argue that it was not a campaign, not orchestrated, that if it had been orchestrated, they'd have been a lot smarter about it. But I was unsuccessful in that. But it did lead to an undercurrent of ill will toward him that when this article then came out about 6 months later, he really didn't have a cushion at the White House.
That was the last straw, and I think as you write in your book that actually you describe this as a pretext that the Vice President used to have McChrystal fired.
Well, the way I describe it is that I think that McChrystal handed his opponents in the White House the ammunition with which to get rid of him.
Mm-hmm. Okay. I want to talk to you very briefly about your political battles in Washington and on Capitol Hill. You do not paint a very flattering picture, and this is not big news, of our political process in Washington. What struck me was your very detailed accounts of interactions with Democratic and Republican members of Congress who, behind closed doors, would tell you that the policies that you were promoting were actually things that had to be done or should be done or were going in the right direction. But when they came out and faced the Klieg lights and spoke to the press, there was a totally opposite description of the situation, and they were highly critical of the president and of the Pentagon. You've been in Washington, or you've been in government a long time. Do you think that our dysfunctional politics are any different from the way they've ever been?
Well, television contributes. I say in the book that when the red light on the television camera would go on in a hearing, it had the effect on members of Congress of a full moon on werewolves. And I guess the way I would put it and the way I write about it in the book is our politics in this country, as this center makes so clear, have been rough and tumble from the very beginning and quite vituperative. Even George Washington in his second term came in for a lot of hits, as did all of his successors. But what is different now, and what has happened over the last, I would say, quarter of a century, is that we have lost the Congress has lost the ability to do the people's business. So it's one thing to argue and fight and say terrible things about each other. That's been going on for our whole history. But the inability to pass legislation, to deal with serious problems, I think is a relatively new phenomenon. And some of it is institutional, has to do with gerrymandering and the fact that in the House, maybe only 50 or 60 seats are now competitive, and so the only elections that really matter in a lot of places are the primaries, where you've got to appeal to your party's base, whether you're Democrats or Republicans. And what we had for the first half of my career were what I would describe as a large number of and I'll just take the Senate, of senators who were center left, center right, who figured out ways to put together coalitions and get important legislation passed. And the list will be familiar to all of you. But these bridge builders, as far as I was concerned, were people like Bill Cohen and Bill Bradley, Jack Danforth, John Warner, David Boren, Sam Nunn, Nancy Kassebaum, Republicans and Democrats, and the list goes on. And maybe the last one to leave because of frustration was Olympia Snowe. So you've got this large number of people, most of whom could have been reelected forever, who left in disgust because they couldn't get anything done. And I think that's the new phenomenon over the last couple of decades that is especially worrying. Now, the other theme, though, in this book, and I think there's an important point to make, despite my frustrations and even my anger at the Congress, the reality is I got a lot of things done with the Congress. Most of my predecessors, if they were lucky, could get 2 or 3 or 4 big military procurement programs canceled that were overcost, overdue, or no longer relevant. I cut nearly 3 dozen and ended up getting congressional approval or acquiescence in all of them. I cut almost $200 billion out of the Pentagon's overhead and even eliminated a combatant command. And I got the Congress to support me on that. Partly it was because I had the enormously strong support of President Obama and a veto threat behind me. But it was also working across the aisle with members of Congress of both parties and figuring out how to move the agenda forward. And so I argue at the end of the book that, we do have these institutional problems, such as gerrymandering, what I consider the weakening of the role of Congress in governance because of the weakening of the committee chairs and a variety of other things. But at the end of the day, the problem you can begin to, I think, address the paralysis, not necessarily the polarization, but the paralysis by people by people in the White House and people in the Congress beginning to treat each other more civilly, by people being willing to listen and take ideas from the other side, of not demonizing the other side, of not distorting the facts purposely. I think there are a bunch of things just in terms of the way people treat each other in Washington that could change the tone. And the reason, and the chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, when I first became secretary, a few months in, told me that my arrival had been important because I changed the tone of the way the debate was being carried on in Iraq and other things. So I was able I guess the undercurrent in this book is I was able to make Washington work, but the way you make it work is through the way you treat people.
Since we're on the subject of politics, and we are running out of time very quickly, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned in the book, deep in the book, there's a little description of a phone call that you've gotten from the Senate Democratic leader, Harry Reid, who wanted the Defense Department, he said, to spend some money on research on irritable bowel syndrome. And this is while you were dealing with wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. There's a great deal of danger here in deploying certain metaphors, and I'm going to try and avoid that. How did that conversation go?
Well, I very politely told him that I would look into it. But he came out yesterday and was very critical of the book, to which my response was, it's just a fact of life that members of Congress vote on things they haven't even read.
Well, as they say, you have to pass the bill to find out what's in it. He called you at one point and asked you whether you'd be interested in running with President Obama as his vice presidential candidate. How did that conversation go?
Well, it was one of the more bizarre conversations I think I've ever had. He called up and we were talking about something else, and then all of a sudden he said, I was largely responsible for talking President Obama into running for president. I heard that from a lot of people on the Hill. And he said, but there's no candidate for vice president. How long have you been a registered Republican? I said, well, I'm actually not a registered Republican. And he said, well, where do you stand on abortion? I said, I don't have a stand on abortion. Somehow that's never come into the national security arena. He said, well, how long were you an academic? I said, well, not all that long. And he said, well, something may come of this or nothing, but I just wanted to check. And I hung up the phone, and I just started to laugh. I said, that is really weird. And as I say in the book, I never told anybody about it because I didn't think anybody'd believe me.
But you did end up working for the president nonetheless. I wanted to, one serious issue that's been raised by this book, and I think an ethics and the way the government functions issue that came up early on in coverage of the book was there's a lot of hand-wringing about these conversations that you had with President Obama. And the focus was always on the conversations with President Obama, not with President Bush, but you revealed much there as well. We're held in confidence that, and indeed, the president often invokes executive privilege with Congress to prevent exactly this kind of information from coming out in the public, so that there can be a free flow of ideas and a kind of free exchange of information. How did you work through the ethics of that? I came away thinking this is actually a public service, that people learn a lot about the way their senior government leaders make very difficult decisions, both Republican and Democrat. But you were disclosing something, and I have no doubt that both presidents didn't anticipate that this would be in a book. How did you work through that?
Well, I think, first of all, I think modern presidents have pretty realistic expectations about what will be written. But that said, I think from my standpoint, what was important, there were a couple of things that were important. The first is, if you actually read the book, the conversations I describe almost entirely paint these presidents in a positive light, because it shows them pushing back against the military, asking hard questions, not allowing themselves to be spoon-fed information, and not just acquiescing because some guy with 4 stars on his shoulder said we ought to do thus and so. So it shows these presidents doing what I think Americans would hope their commander-in-chiefs would do. And it underscores that these two presidents, just like almost all of their predecessors, have disagreed with the military at various times and made decisions that the military had not recommended. But the second piece of this is, this book is dedicated to the men and women of the U.S. Armed Forces. And I wrote this book in substantial measure for the troops and their families. And one of the things I wanted them to see under both of these presidents and in both Iraq and Afghanistan, I wanted them to see what the Washington battle space looked like. They knew what Iraq and Afghanistan looked like, but I wanted them to have some insight into the real world of what was going on in Washington as big issues associated with these wars were discussed, and to give them some sense of the passion and the amount of time spent debating these issues and the decisions that they would make. And I think that it is a realistic portrayal of the wars that were being fought in Washington. At the same time, there were wars being fought in Iraq and Afghanistan. And final point, people's memories are short, especially in Washington. But the reality is, all through 2010, senior White House staffers were leaking what the president was thinking, what his conversations were, his criticisms of the military, and so on and so forth, on a routine basis in the newspapers. So the notion that what I describe in the book as the president's growing reservations about the decisions he had made is absolutely no news. The newspapers were full of that information all through 2010 and the first part of 2011.
I do agree with you. There is your descriptions of both Bush and President Obama are often very laudatory, but there is quite a bit of critical commentary in there as well. And I think one portion of this book strikes me as very much in that vein. You take the President Obama to task for being what I would characterize as an uninspiring military leader. He didn't bring enthusiasm to his role as commander-in-chief, especially as regards the Afghanistan war. And you, I think, had a conversation with Rahm Emanuel where you made that point, that the soldiers needed to hear that the president was behind, as you called it, the mission. That is a very, and you drew that conclusion from your interactions with him in these inner councils.
Yeah, in trying to weigh this and balance it, I supported every single one of President Obama's decisions on Afghanistan, including up to the decision to seek the strategic agreement with the Afghans that would keep a residual force there after the end of this year. But there were two aspects of the war in Afghanistan that troubled me. And one was the president's suspicion of the motives of the senior military, particularly when it came to their recommendations on Afghanistan. And the second was what you described. As I told Rahm when I met with him, I don't mind that the president speaks out on exit strategies and so on. But the troops need to hear from their commander, the person who is sending them in harm's way, that their cause is just and noble, and the mission is important for the country, and therefore their sacrifice is worthwhile. In the 2.5 years I worked for President Obama, he only did that once or twice. And I think that's one of the responsibilities of the commander-in-chief when he deploys men and women in harm's way, is that he be willing to speak publicly to why that is important and why their potential sacrifice is worthwhile.
Did you ever try to broach this with the president himself?
No, as you say, I raised it directly with Rahm, and I said, the president has to take ownership of this war. And I think on probably a few occasions, I mentioned to the president that he ought to go say more about why it's important to do this. But the interesting thing is, once he made this very difficult decision in November 2009, where he overrode the political recommendations of his vice president and all of his political advisors, to approve this surge, there never was really, other than the initial speech at West Point on December 1st, there was really not any kind of a White House effort over the ensuing months for there to be any kind of a campaign with the American public to tell them why those decisions were important and why this cause was important.
One last question. You mentioned in the book that you had urged the senior White House staff not to leak information about the raid to kill Osama bin Laden, and of course the information leaked out within 5 hours. Who leaked that information?
Well, I like to tell people, first of all, that the Department of Defense wrote the book on leaking. So I'm not trying to pretend that the Defense Department is innocent in this category, although the Defense Department is very good about holding secret military plans and tactics and techniques that might put troops' lives at risk. So in this case, my belief is that I'll describe the scene. We're at the very end of our time in the Situation Room. We know bin Laden's been killed. He's back in Jalalabad. He's on his way to a watery grave. And we're about to break up as the president is going upstairs to address the nation and tell them about this extraordinary success. And I said, now look, before everybody goes, we use these tactics and techniques every night in Afghanistan in going after Taliban and al-Qaeda leaders. So it's important that everybody agree that all we're going to say is that we killed him and not get into any details about the operation and how we did it. And as you say, I write in the book, that lasted about 5 hours. And everybody agreed after I made this little pitch, everybody agreed. We sort of like little kids did our little blood oath kind of thing. We wouldn't do this, and it all lasted about 5 hours. I believe that the leaks primarily came from the White House and CIA, who just couldn't wait to brag about how good this had been.
But as you point out,
and then I think about 2 weeks later, defense probably started to chime in.
Right, but you write that there was a significant operational downside to doing that because the model for that raid was the raids that were being done every night in Afghanistan and in Iraq to apprehend and remove from what you call the battle space these al-Qaeda commanders and Taliban people. There was a significant cost to that.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay. We have some questions from the audience, and I'd like to pose them to you. But before I do that, very quickly, is there anything that you did that you wish you could have done again? And I also, before I say that, you write very movingly about the difficulty in coping with the casualties and your responsibility for that. And I highly and that part of the book was very well written. And I highly recommend that people focus on that.
Well, I think I'm fairly. I think I'm blunt and candid in describing mistakes that others made. I am equally blunt and candid in describing mistakes that I think I made. And just to answer your question, one, for example, is that I allowed a fairly dysfunctional chain of command problem in Afghanistan to continue longer than I should have, where the U.S. commander in Afghanistan actually didn't have command over all the American troops serving in Afghanistan. And while I asked 2 successive chairmen of the Joint Chiefs to try and fix it, it was ultimately my responsibility, and I took too long. I finally fixed it, but I took too long to get there. That's just one example.
Just to follow that up very quickly, you write in the book that Richard Holbrooke, the special envoy, and I think Karl Eichenberry, the ambassador, were working against the re-election campaign of our ally there, Hamid Karzai. And you didn't seem to be very happy about that. How did that happen?
Well, first of all, I mean, Karzai may have his shortcomings, but he sure as heck knows what's going on in his own capital. And so the idea that we could do this and him not know we were trying to get rid of him was pretty naive in my view. And so when you see all these problems that Karzai creates for us, his knowing that we, for all practical purposes, attempted a putsch against him in the summer of 2009 probably didn't help the relationship.
And he's still there, nursing some resentments, I'm sure. So I have some questions for you from the audience, and I'd like to read you. And here's a statement, first of all, just a flat-out position paper. Thank you for your long-time commitment to protecting my family and country. Get well soon. Godspeed, and go Aggies. You're I'm going to have a little trouble reading this, but it is my understanding that the chairman of the Joint Chiefs is directly responsible to the president. What valuable input do we lose when the chairman is obsequious to a domineering Secretary of Defense?
Well, I think the chain of command actually does not include the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Nor does it include the vice president. It goes from the president to the Secretary of Defense to a combatant commander. So under the National Security Act of 1947, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff is one of the statutory advisors to the NSC, one of only two, the other the head of intelligence. He is the president's senior military advisor, and he is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. He has no direct command authority. And I will say both President Bush and President Obama gave the Joint Chiefs, including the chairman, all the time they wanted. And in my experience, and I watched two different chairmen under two different presidents, and I never saw either of them be obsequious or the president try to intimidate them or sort of dampen their views by being sarcastic or harsh or insulting or intimidating in any way. Both of these presidents, despite the fact that they both disagreed with the chairman on a number of occasions, were very respectful and gave them all kinds of time. And I always made sure, first of all, I considered it critical for me to get the most blunt possible advice from my senior military officials. And I'll give you an example of it, and it'll probably have to be bleeped. But when it came time for me to decide whether to extend military tours in Iraq and Afghanistan from 12 to 15 months, I was working with the military and trying to decide. This was a very difficult decision, and I knew it would have big consequences for military families. And my senior military advisor comes to me at one point, and he says, "The troops know you have to make this decision, and they think you're an asshole for not making it." That's the kind of candor that I tried to encourage among the senior military, and I believe that I had a very good relationship with them, and they would disagree with me on more than one occasion. The MRAPs was an example, the medevac was another, the number of drones was another. So I tried to encourage an environment where they would speak up and where they would be honest and candid. And I think any Secretary of Defense or President who does not want that kind of candor is making a terrible and, frankly, dangerous mistake.
Yet this caused, it seemed to me, judging from your book, endless frustration with both President Bush and President Obama, Mike Mullen, the Joint Chief Chairman, on a number of occasions.
Well, it wasn't just Mike. It was a number of other senior military, and their frustration and impatience was not over what the senior military would tell them in the Situation Room or in the Oval Office or even in open testimony. It was what they would go out and say in public speeches or television interviews and things like that. That's what got under both of these presidents' skin.
Right, and I could see why it would. It seems to me there's a very difficult line to draw there. On the one hand, you want to get good advice. This is a democracy. Citizens need and expect a certain level of transparency and information from their leaders, and yet if a military leader is off the reservation and pursuing or promoting a policy agenda that differs with the White House, it seems to me that could cause tremendous difficulties.
Well, and it's not only one that potentially, pursuing an agenda that differs from the White House, it's speaking out about things that in some way or another limit the president's options or telegraph consequences that maybe the president would rather keep private during a period of deliberation. So, I mean, one of the things that I write about at the end in terms of civil-military relationships is the consequences of senior military speaking out too often and in areas which are not necessarily their direct responsibility or in terms of preempting the president.
I have another question here, very simple, and I think the answer is simple. Which book tour interview have you enjoyed the most, Charlie Rose or Jon Stewart? And I would have to add, of course, the answer now has to be this stop on the book tour.
Well, let's just say that the interviews with Jon Stewart and Charlie Rose were somewhat different in nature, but both were enjoyable.
Do you think the United States should adopt a policy of national service in place of the draft?
I believe if I could wave a magic wand, what I would favor is required national service that is not limited to the military. I believe that every young person in America, between certain ages, 18 to 28 or 25 or whatever, ought to spend a year or two or three if in the military providing national service, of giving back to the country something in exchange for what they've been given. We hear so much in this country about our rights as citizens, and we hear so little about our obligations as citizens. And so whether it's tutoring in inner city or rural schools or working in hospitals, Teach for America, a new version of the Civilian Conservation Corps, there's a host of different things young people could do for some period of time. And, for example, if you volunteered for the military, you'd have to commit for 3 years, but maybe you'd get paid significantly more than in the other areas, partly because of the risk and so on. But I think, and where I'm torn is that there is whether such service should be required or whether it should be voluntary. But the voluntary piece of it would involve some measure of pressure in the sense that you would be, if you had not performed national service, you would be significantly disadvantaged in admissions for universities, in the hiring process for jobs. That, in other words, this would come to be seen as a moral and ethical obligation on the part of a young person. And if you chose not to serve, it would weigh against you in some of the choices in your life. But I strongly believe that there ought to be, you would find that the military leadership is totally against a draft. And I think I share that. But I think it ought to be broadened, that service ought to be broadened for everybody.
Last question for you. As you look into the future, what do you see as the greatest threat to the security of the United States?
Well, in all honesty, I think that the greatest immediate threat to the United States is, in fact, the paralysis that we see in the 2 square miles that encompass Capitol Hill and the White House. If we can't begin seriously to address the problems that we face, whether it's education or immigration or the deficit or the national debt, a host of other problems, none of those problems can be solved in the span of one presidency or one Congress. So the only way we actually can make headway against those problems is through bipartisan solutions that can be sustained through more than one presidency and Congress. And if we can't begin to get past this paralysis in Washington, then I think we're in serious trouble. If you want to talk about national security issues, I think we have to worry about cyber. We have to worry about a terrorist in this country with a weapon of mass destruction. We have to worry about Iran. We have to worry about North Korea. And we have to worry about something inadvertently creating a crisis in the South China Sea. Those are all kind of out there on the horizon as far as I'm concerned as significant problems. But the biggest challenge we face is getting our own house in order.
Secretary Gates, thank you so much. It's very interesting.